And we're live. It is Monday, August 17th, 2020, 5:01 p.m., 5:02 p.m. It's one of those days when I have gotten absolutely nothing done for no good reason. And I have very little to say of consequence. But Kate, maybe you have a monologue or something you want to say.
Oh, I was going to say something. Well, not really. I'm trying to decide whether people really want to hear my monologue or not.
Yes, they do.
Well, Tony wants to hear about my tomatoes. I actually have never talked about my garden very much on In Lieu of Fun. But when John and I decamped to this house, which is my family's house, my parents' house, actually, as they have just informed us that they want us to leave eventually. Hi, Jameel.
Okay.
Hello, Jameel.
How are you?
So I'm in this house in a very lovely place, but it is not mine. But my parents were just so happy that I was out of Brooklyn and that we had left voluntarily without them trying to convince us that they were like, sure, do whatever you want. In which I promptly built probably 100 square yards of raised bed gardens and had all of this dirt delivered and built this whole thing. Turned the entire living room into a greenhouse and was grew all of these tomato seeds by hand. And anyways, I finished out the project, and it is now August, which is tomato season, and they're all finally coming in, all of these beautiful heirloom tomatoes, and it has been.
Are you going to send them to Colorado?
Colorado?
Well, there's this guy in Colorado who sent you a present.
He did. That guy in Colorado sent me a present. I should send him some tomatoes. Maybe I will. I could also send him, apparently I have 1 million cucumbers now, too, which is not... I specifically didn't grow zucchini because God knows that, whenever you plant one zucchini plant, you get, 8 billion zucchini, so I didn't do that. Anyway, it's been, this has kind of been this weird period of waiting for many months. That has fit perfectly along with the entire theme of current events, of just feeling like we're waiting for more news and everyone is living with uncertainty. And I have just kind of been doing that with the tomatoes, and now it's turned out okay. They're all on the vine, they're here, they're ripening. I get really neurotic and pick them the second they show color because I don't want anything to get at them. And yeah, so I have the most over-parented garden in the history of man. I think a lot of people do, actually, because people just have nothing else to do.
Not me.
Yeah.
I have my garden is covered in weeds. They
really?
are the kind of weeds that have claws, and if you walk out there, they grab your leg and yank you in, and you disappear. And they can only be handled with a weed whacker. Here's Gurgi. Hello, Gurgi.
Anyways.
We are not allowed to have fun anymore.
And in lieu
of fun, we have Jameel Jaffer.
Yay!
Who is COVID bearded and informal looking.
I actually trimmed it for this, so.
Welcome to the show, Jameel.
I didn't wash my hair, so that's that's more than I did. How are you?
This is my first time on the show. They were I don't know how many shows you've done now, but I've done 150 shows, and maybe I wouldn't be so concerned about it.
We're at 144.
Wow.
But the more interesting fact is that it is 144 days in a row of show. There is no break. And so that means in 36 shows, we will be at 6 months of show every day, which is more than, frankly, I think either Kate or I expected to do.
We did not think this was going to happen. Anyway.
Puts a lot of pressure on you,
I can't believe you guys, I can't believe this is your first time on. I talk about you constantly on the show because you're always doing something related to like law and tech, or we're talking about First Amendment or something. And like, it's crazy. Like, we just haven't, you're busy with actual work stuff.
Doing litigation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what are you working on these days? Give us the Jameel Jaffer Knight Center update, Knight Institute update.
You know, mainly I'm working on keeping my kids under control. You know, we have 3 little kids at home, so I litigate in the spaces between their obligations. But we have this. The Knight Institute is going strong in spite of the challenges of the pandemic. You know, we are now. So when I started there almost 4 years ago, and when I started, it was
Has it been 4 years?
Yeah, 4
oh my
years
God.
in September. Yeah,
that's nuts.
But it was just me, and now it's 20 of us, and so it feels like a real organization, and it's a great, amazing team, just great people. Half of them are litigators, and we're working on all sorts of issues that both of you think about all the time, including some of the same national security stuff that I've been working on for now, I don't know, almost 20 years. And then some new stuff relating to technology and privacy and the First Amendment, which is the stuff that you think about all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting intersection of how Ben and I know you. It was at the fateful. We have now had almost every person who was at that table at that Stanford roundtable. Yeah. That incredible, I would think that was one of the best conferences that Ben and I agree has ever happened, that we all really felt. It was like, we haven't had on. Yeah, it was a good conference, right?
Yeah.
It was a good conference. It was one of those things that so Jack Goldsmith and I, were doing this project for Hoover, and we invited a bunch of people and everybody came. And so there wasn't anybody there who wasn't sort of on the A-list of people we had meant to be there. And it was, when you actually do an invite list of your kind of dream team of people and everybody shows up, even a conference, and I am really anti-conference, can be interesting. So that was a really good conversation.
Yeah.
So,
in our current circumstances, we look back nostalgically on even the bad conferences, I think.
Exactly, because at least they involved social interaction.
Exactly, right.
I mean, I really went to, I don't have kids yet. Like, there's just like, I go to a lot of conferences. I'm really lucky to get invited to speak at a lot of stuff. And like, actually, as you know, Jameel, you got to go to the Bahamas and I stayed home in Brooklyn right before pandemic, and recorded a very prescient video thing for the federal bar conference. But like, I miss it. Like, it was a real hallway effect of kind of like having people that are working on adjacent ideas to yours that you would never necessarily kind of cross swords with. What you disagree?
I miss many things, but conferences is not one of them.
No, it's not the conference.
It's not like conferences. It's like round tables.
And it's also just interaction with people you didn't anticipate interacting with or even know would be there. It's now everything is so planned, right? You plan a Zoom call with the people you want to speak with, and unless you're Zoom bombed, there's nobody else in that room except the people you've invited. And so your life is a lot more predictable, and I think even sort of intellectually, you're not confronted with new ideas as often as you might be, at least face to face, as you might be if you could interact with people in person. We find this even at the Knight. I'm sure this is not unique to us, but at the Knight Institute, I think that we've been, we've done pretty well in this transition from working in person to working remotely. But the thing that's hard is coming up with new ideas and developing new ideas. You can continue working on projects that you've had in motion for some time, relatively easily. But the new idea stuff was a function of happenstance meetings in the hallway, or that kind of stuff, and that doesn't happen nearly as much anymore. And so we really, I'm sure that other people are having these challenges too, but we're really thinking hard about how to recreate those kinds of spaces where you're not talking about some specific project that you already had in the works for a long time, but you're brainstorming or
germinating with people who think adjacently to the subjects that you do.
Yeah.
So how are you? That's a really interesting point, because as somebody, so to me, the major value of conferences is somebody says something interesting, and you say to that person, "Hey, you should write that up for Lawfare," which 70% of the time they don't, but 30% of the time they do. And this is the genesis ultimately of In Lieu of Fun, you say to somebody at a conference, "Hey, I really enjoyed your comments. You're pretty interesting. Let's do a project together." And she says to you, "What are you talking about?" And you say, "I don't know, but it'll come to me eventually." And then someday there's a pandemic, and you're like, "Okay, like this is the time. Remember that time." I don't have a good substitute for that in this environment, because I just don't meet people, and so what's the version, like, I'm pretty well in touch with the people that I know and that I care about, although apparently not as closely in touch as I should be with some of them, because sometimes I find out from Twitter that one of them's died of COVID-19, right? And so, you're aware that your world has contracted a bit, but it's contracted in the literal sense. I haven't met a person I don't know, except people like John Bordeaux and Pauline Brock on In Lieu of Fun, in 6 months. And so how do you, what's the mechanism by which you kind of put yourself next to ideas that are adjacent to the work that you're doing and germinate new ideas, new projects?
I hate to say it, but it's Twitter is the closest thing we've got.
Well, right, but isn't
that's a scary thought?
But it's so true. I completely agree with Jameel. Say more, Jameel, but this is kind of in line with your Knight v. Twitter litigation, because I do think I meant to we have to talk about TikTok at some point. I also would love to talk to you just about the change in public spaces of these platforms since COVID. I kind of ended my Facebook oversight board piece with this, which was kind of in an age where all of a sudden everything from people dying is done over FaceTime to your gatherings and your protests are done via social media. Is this any longer a private space? And how are we going to navigate that? And we certainly don't have any answers. And I think that this is a great example of that. And no one's talking, I feel, about the assembly issues, either the First Amendment assembly issues, either in the context of the protests, in the context of the masking rules. I think people have been very easy to defer to public health stuff. So I'm dying to know what you think about those types of things.
A few people have called me over the last 6 weeks to say nobody's talking about these assembly issues. So at the very least, people have now recognized that nobody's talking about these assembly issues, and they want to do something about it. So I guess that's a promising sign.
And how do you, for those who don't know the shorthand, these assembly issues refers to what?
Well, I mean, I think it refers to, among other things, pandemic-related challenges to our getting together in one place, exchanging ideas, acting collectively in the ways that we used to act collectively in public spaces. And there's to some extent, I think, the Black Lives Matter protests show that even the pandemic can't completely constrain that kind of activity. But that activity was, more restrained than it would have been, but for the pandemic. And then, online there are these questions of like, what does it mean to assemble online? Like, what is a set of rights that's protected by the First Amendment? Like, I don't mean to narrow it to the First Amendment question, but that's part of it. What's the set of rights that's protected by the First Amendment in this context? And, when we litigated, I guess we're still litigating these social media cases involving public officials' social media accounts. We didn't litigate them as assembly cases. We didn't think of them that way, although maybe we should have. We thought of them.
I don't think you were alone with that, by the way. Like, I don't.
No, but you treated it as a limited public forum case.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We did, but that that's speech clause stuff, right? I don't. And then we had a kind of petition arguments as well. We didn't use the language of assembly unless you think of public forum doctrine as the language of assembly rights, which maybe you should. But we litigated those cases and are still litigating those cases, public forum cases, as cases involving burdens on the right of access to information, burdens on the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And initially it was all about, initially it was a case about, the first case we filed was about obviously Trump and his infamous Twitter account. But, I think over the last year or the last 2.5 years, and recently, especially because of the pandemic, the social media has become so much more important as a way of distributing information, even government, important government information about, for example, public health. And all of these issues that came up in this, which seemed like a kind of unique context of Trump's Twitter account, are actually much more far-reaching and significant. If you think about government agencies, for example, that share information about various kinds of emergencies through their social media accounts. Like if you are in Florida before the hurricane and you want information about should you evacuate or not, or where do you get emergency help, all of that comes from government agencies' social media accounts. And
that's not even getting into like the places in like some of the places that Facebook and Twitter have gone to with 0 rating that have like control places that are like not only the internet, but have now like government websites have disappeared and they run their government websites through a Facebook group.
Right.
And like things like that. And they're just like these crazy, like kind of folding in of public and private.
Well, have you followed, this is a slightly adjacent topic, but have you followed this this dispute over the Army and Navy's Twitch, esports Twitch channels?
Yes.
These are all that, a lot of the words I just used I didn't know until a month ago. But
no, I follow Twitch really closely because I kind of think that gaming is like increasingly going to be just like it's always been a huge vector for hate speech and terrible misogyny, terrible
gaming
everything.
And porn is where everything that is going to happen tomorrow in political and cultural life is already happeing.
Yeah.
And people don't understand it if they're not gamers. But sorry, Jameel, but what were you going to say? Explain to everyone what's going on with it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe everybody already knows this, but the military, the Army and Navy are using Twitch, which is this gaming platform, for recruiting, and they have what they call esports teams made up of military personnel who play these video games in these forums in which other users can interact with the players, interact with one another, and in the language of the First Amendment, this is public forum stuff again, but a very different context. And over the last few weeks, the Army and Navy, this happened 3 or 4 weeks ago now, Army and Navy both started blocking people, I guess banning is the word they use on Twitter, banning people from these Twitch channels or asking questions about war crimes. So some people in these forums would raise questions about U.S. war crimes, or point out what they saw as hypocrisy in the players' statements about the military. And the response of the Army and Navy was to block these people. And it's a very new context. It's not Twitter anymore or Facebook. It's this gaming platform, but the same set of issues as
Twitch is huge.
Yeah,
Twitch is no joke.
3 million users, I think, in the U.S., which is significant. And then they have this Discord. These Discord servers. Discord is another social media platform. Maybe you both used it. I don't know.
Is Twitch only 3 million? That doesn't sound right to me.
That's what they say on their website.
Yeah. Okay, but I think globally they're huge in Asia.
Is that right?
And,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, enormous. Like, that's actually, I think, where most of their users are based, because that's where most of the pro online gamers are based.
Right. Well, I'm sure that.
Sorry, not to be totally nerdy about this.
No, I'm sure it'll grow quickly in the U.S. too, and obviously this particular issue is just a little corner of Twitch, but these questions about what are the rules in these forums that the government controls on social media go far beyond Trump, and they go far beyond Twitter, and I think we're kind of seeing that play out now.
And I take it you think the rule should be that the government has no obligation to create a forum for discussion of anything, but once it does, the forum has to be neutral as to views.
That's right.
Yep.
I agree with that.
Right? Yeah.
I
think that's right.
Yeah. I kind of don't debating this case because I feel like it's just so obvious what the right answer is.
All you have to do is change it to a religious discussion, and it becomes blindingly obvious, right? So if the government creates on Twitch, leave aside whether it be an establishment clause problem to create. Well, if they created a forum for discussion of the big issues, and then they forbade any expression of Catholic beliefs, you would say they're really not allowed to do that, right? The Muslims can talk and the atheists can talk, but if you say anything good about the Pope, they're going to take it down, right? This is exactly the same. It's exactly the same case.
I think that there are hard questions here. There are hard questions, not so much on viewpoint, but when it comes to what kinds of subject matter limitations the government could impose. So imagine that. I won't say this is a hard question, but it's slightly harder than the one we've just been talking about. Imagine that on Twitch, the Army says, this is for conversation about the military. And you can raise whatever questions you want about the military. We're not going to ban people on the basis of viewpoint. But you can't raise questions about, foreign relations foreign relations are too close, but healthcare, okay, in this space. So those are, that becomes a slightly harder question.
I think that's okay.
Slightly harder questions about what counts as a true threat, online or in this kind of space. Some public figures have justifiably complained, and political leaders have justifiably, especially women and minorities, have complained about harassment on these platforms and in these public, in these particular spaces. And where the lines are there, I think, is something that the courts still haven't, completely worked out, and it'll take some time for the courts to work that stuff out. I think it's complicated. Or even, like what the Army said in response to, we wrote them a letter saying you can't block people on the basis that they ask questions about war crimes. And they wrote back and they said, we didn't block people on that basis. We blocked people because they asked questions repeatedly. They're spamming. And, these questions of what's just asking a question 2 or 3 times in a slightly different way and what's spam is, these kinds of questions are factually you know, you're going to have to draw
Right,
lines in gray areas. So there are.
but I think you look. I agree that there is lot. I mean, I don't mean to outflank your litigating position, but that said, I do think you're being kind of generous here.
I'm trying to make it interesting, then, you know.
Hey, look, I know a position that that is carefully crafted so that no reasonable judge can reject it. Look, I mean, I actually totally agree that there is, the government is certainly allowed to set up a forum for here we're going to discuss healthcare, and that means that if it's not about healthcare, we're not going to discuss it. Now, whether that means blocking people from being in the forum at all, or merely deleting irrelevant posts is maybe a separate question. That strikes me as totally kosher. I also think it's kosher to say, if you have a neutral rule, if you publish the same thing 5 times, we're going to disallow you. Yeah. And by the way, all the people who are doing that are doing it because they're trying to say war crimes, war crimes, war crimes. Fine, they get blamed, but you got to have a neutral rule. And if the only people that you're blocking are people who look like they're giving dissenting views, you're not going to you shouldn't get the benefit of the doubt on some of the other stuff.
You're so unusually reasonable on this stuff, man.
We don't usually talk about
reasonable. You just never talk about the stuff that you're both reasonable about.
No, Jameel and I have a long history of headbutting, but we've always been pleasant to one another, and we find to our mutual surprise. If I had known that, I would have invited
you on, Ben.
No, we find to our mutual surprise that we agree about a lot of things.
For a clash here, you know.
So here, let's talk about some of the stuff that we have disagreed about in the past.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Okay, which was like
also
the entire Obama administration.
I still want to talk about TikTok at some point. Just flagging that.
But we found. I want to come back to TikTok too, but let me just say one more thing about. I think we did find some national security litigation that we agree about, because
that's correct.
We are, so it's another case that we're working on at the Knight Institute. We are challenging the constitutionality of various intelligence agencies' pre-publication review regimes. And I bet your audience knows those regimes well, or many people in your audience.
Some do, some don't. Give a little primer on it.
Yeah, so basically all the intelligence agencies have these rules that require former government employees, to submit manuscripts for government approval before they publish them. So if you leave government and you want to write about your government service and you work for one of the intelligence agencies, you have to submit your manuscript to the CIA or the FBI, whatever the agency was, have them review it for classified information, before you can publish the manuscript. And we can assume for the purposes of this discussion that some version of that system could be constitutional, but the version of the system we have now is broken in multiple respects. Nobody knows what needs to be submitted because the regulations are very, very complicated. They use terms that are vague and undefined. Once they submit, nobody knows what the censors are reviewing for. Yes, they're reviewing for classified information, but many of them seem to think they can review for other things too, including for information that just casts the agency in an unfavorable light. There's so many manuscripts now that are submitted to the agencies that there are very long delays in review, and so some people submit their books and wait months or even more than a year for a response from the agency, by which time the topic that you are writing about is no longer in the news and the public doesn't care about it anymore. And then some people can kind of jump the line It seems that people jump the line when they had more senior positions in the agency, or when the stories they're telling are consistent with the agency's preferred narrative of its activities. And all of that is, in my view, and in the view of many others, a kind of First Amendment scandal. This is maybe the most extensive system of prior restraints still in operation in the United States. Millions of people, literally millions of people, are subject to it because every former employee of these agencies, including anyone who's in the military, is subject to a pre-publication review requirement of some kind. And hundreds of thousands of manuscripts are reviewed by these agencies under these rules that nobody understands. And by nobody, I need to include the censors themselves, who struggle to figure out what their authority is and what they're supposed to be doing. And the consequence of this is not just that people who want to write things that they feel very strongly about can't write those things or can't publish them when they want to, or even close to the time they want to publish them in. But also that the public is denied access to often important information or stories by people who have unique insights into the operation of the agencies they were once part of. And especially in this particular landscape, the national security landscape, in which the public gets so little information about how these agencies operate, these voices really are particularly crucial. If you think back, I know that Ben and I probably see these particular stories in different ways, but if you think back to the Bush administration's interrogation policies, detention and torture policies, and think about the people who brought those abuses to light. A lot of those people submitted manuscripts that were ultimately heavily redacted by the CIA, published many months after the manuscripts were finished, after the time they would have been most valuable to the public. And meanwhile, the people who had authorized these policies and choreographed the torture in CIA black sites were able to get their books published right away with very few redactions. Because the CIA was completely on board with the stories they were telling. Whatever you think of the relative merits of those two sides of the debate, if you want to call it a debate, I don't think you can plausibly argue that that system is consistent with the First Amendment. So that we brought that challenge. We filed it in the district court maybe a year ago. We lost in district court in the Eastern District of Virginia. On the grounds that the system had been affirmed by the Supreme Court in a case called United States v. Snap in 1980, and we are now
not to be super dorky, but are you in the Eastern District of Virginia bar, or do you have someone?
No, we have local counsel. In that case,
Okay.
we're co-counseling with the ACLU, and the ACLU of Virginia is also papers. Yeah.
So I am almost entirely in agreement with you on the constitutional issues aside. My experiences with the pre-pub review system, which are indirect, they're as a publisher, not as because I'm not subject to it, having never worked in government. They are so divergent, and people are so differentially deferential to it. So I have writers who submit everything they do, and then if I edit them, they will resubmit it. And by the way, if you're a former Justice Department official, the Justice Department takes for frickin' ever to review stuff. On the other hand, my colleague Susan Hennessy, when she came out of NSA, she was pretty, she would submit a lot of stuff to NSA. They never took more than 48 hours to review something that she wrote. And they can be wildly different in how aggressive they are about thinking about something as classified. Your obligations to submit is something that is or may be classified. and the scope of the obligations are incomprehensible to discern. And I don't want to name the individual in question and I want to be careful about how I talk about it, but I think Jameel will know who I'm talking about. I recently spent many, many months with a friend who had a manuscript that simply did not get reviewed by an agency. I mean, it wasn't that they identified in a John Bolton-like way reasonably quickly, okay, we think there's classified material in here. It's just that they didn't look at it.
Yeah.
And in that same time frame, the same agency was releasing lots of disparaging information. And so I do think, to go back to our original discussion, I do think there have to be neutral rules, and it doesn't matter if you're a critic of interrogation policy or a defender of interrogation policy. The rules should be the same rules, and that's the same if you're somebody John Durham doesn't like, or somebody that John Durham wants to go have a beer with.
The Bolton case, as you know, I'm not a fan of John Bolton.
Nor am I.
Yeah.
Another thing you guys agree on.
Yeah. But I think that his case does illustrate the problems with the system. I think that the system is so manipulable by insiders. In this case, it was the White House, right? And the White House basically saw the pre-publication review system as a mechanism it could use to suppress a book that it didn't want out there. Now, obviously, they messed it up royally. They probably sold more books for him as a result of what they did. But they did delay the book. They did delay the book's publication, and I think that Bolton's experience was unusual only in its visibility to the rest of us. For every Bolton, there are 1,000 other people who go through this system, have similar experiences, not with the White House, but with their agencies, with censors in their agencies who don't like what they're writing, don't have the ability to bring it to public attention in the way that John Bolton does. And just as a result, don't publish their manuscripts or publish them, months or even longer after they intended to publish them. And by the time they're able to publish those things, the public has moved on. And our discourse around national security is impoverished because those voices are missing.
So there's a great question there. I hate leaving our guests hanging. So actually, let's go to David's question, and then I'll ask mine later.
So, which question? I'll start with...
Stick them both in. They're both interesting, and the answer to one of them may be haven't heard of the case, which will, at least in my case, it would be haven't heard of the case. So we could, if that's the case, we can dispense with it quickly, and if Jameel has heard of the case, it's an interesting one.
So, number one, the current administration has been very reluctant to share information, particularly on matters where the norms have changed. This is set against an environment of retribution against whistleblowers and reporters in general. So what measures are available in the short term? And some of us are looking at our clocks and thinking about between now and in November 3rd or now in January. But what measures are available to try and bring accountability in the near term? And the other matter that is I think kind of an interesting First Amendment situation is where a Twitter user retweeted a tweet of somebody who took a picture of a police officer and said, "Identify this guy." And the person who did the retweet is now facing felony charges.
Yeah.
Wait, can you just let him know where it's in New Jersey, right, David? I'm not sure. I just want to give Jameel a little bit of context so he knows exactly where he's dealing. I think that's cases
It's-
in New Jersey.
Yeah, I'd have to look. It's
Okay.
in the U.S.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have seen a little bit about that case, on social media, but I don't actually know the details of it. From your description, it sounds outrageous to me. Obviously the details matter. I mean, I can imagine a situation where the government could plausibly claim that, well, I don't know. I don't want to give the government the benefit of every doubt here. But I think, the description you've given sounds outrageous to me. And unless the facts are very, very unusual, I can't imagine how that can possibly be consistent with the First Amendment. But I think that there are a lot of First Amendment issues that turn out, that I kind of assumed were settled, that turn out not to be settled in relation to protests in particular. And these questions about
Hurley has never been so relevant, I feel like.
Yeah, well, so questions like, do federal agents have to wear identifying badges and insignia, right? Or in what circumstances do they have to? And I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration sent in people with no badges, in part because they knew it would be intimidating to protesters. The whole point was to intimidate people from exercising their First Amendment rights. That may not have been the only point, but I think it was part of the point. And Trump himself, as usual, essentially confirmed it at one point in one of his statements. But the law on this is messy, and by the time we got our act together we sent a letter to the Attorney General at one point over this practice in DC, and I don't think because of our letter, but for other reasons, they withdrew those federal agents just a few days later, and so litigation that we had contemplated we just never had the opportunity to pursue it. But that set of questions over, I see that as a kind of First Amendment question, but there's very little First Amendment law on this issue of, what kinds of chilling effects are actionable under the First Amendment in this kind of context, right? If the government adopts a practice like this with a specific purpose of dissuading people from exercising their First Amendment rights, what do you need to show in order to establish a First Amendment violation? There's not a lot out there on that. Or the question of, is there a right of access to the names of federal agents who are, or not just federal agents, but government agents who are pulling people off the streets? Like we've seen these videos from New York where undercover officers, just jump on some protester and haul that person into a car and drive off. And you can come at this from many different angles, but since I have a First Amendment hammer, I come at it with the First Amendment. And I wonder, isn't there shouldn't there be an argument that the public has a right of access to that kind of information? You have a right to know who's arresting people.
But what about like, how does that intersect with the Fourth Amendment? Because this has long been, in fact, your wife taught me this, or your partner taught me this. Alice taught me this back in the day. I will never forget her teaching the soccer mom. Well, was the soccer mom case? I can't remember, but it was like you had been pulled over and it was for a violation, and whether you were required to furnish your identification for a violation or something like that. But anyways, like, all of this being the case, like, the question for civil libertarians and for a lot of people who care about this type of thing is like, has long been that there is this like overreach, that there is a compelled speech argument to furnishing your identification to a government. I don't think that's the strongest argument against like that, but like I that is like a standing kind of like complaint.
Right. Well, I think that, to me, sort of the more general, like, forget these specific cases of, the one you just mentioned or the ones I mentioned earlier. And the thing that surprised me, or maybe surprise is the wrong word, but the thing that I'm confronted with when I think through these cases is that the First Amendment has been stretched in so many kind of interesting and unexpected ways. It protects the right of data brokers to to collect data and sell data, or use data in targeted advertising. Social media companies say that it protects them from various forms of government regulation. Protects the right of political contributors to give money to candidates. And these are not things that you can look at the First Amendment and you would expect the First Amendment to protect. There are arguments for and against all these things, but just put them to the side. They're just unexpected, right? If you read the First Amendment, those kinds of things don't follow naturally from the language of the First Amendment. But the things that do follow more naturally, just the right, the right to protest and the right to petition the government, like those things are not protected in the way that you would expect them to be. There's just very little law protecting those basic rights. Now, maybe that's in part because those rights have never felt as threatened as they do now. Although I suspect that's not.
The Palmer raids and
but
were pretty ugly.
It's an odd thing, right? That the First Amendment protects all these things that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to protect, but then the things that you sort of take for granted that the First Amendment protects, there's very little law to ground an argument. And that's something that has, that I've stumbled on again and again over the past, 6 months.
And why do you think that is? I mean, leaving aside the why it reaches all these questions that don't follow naturally from its text or follow obviously from its text, why do you think that it leaves so much room for infringement, or that there's so little law on the possible infringement of stuff that it seems to address pretty directly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that isn't the answer obvious? The answer is that the First Amendment, like probably most other amendments, the shape of the First Amendment is a result of political power. Who has political power? And the First Amendment protects people who have it, and not people who don't. Now, it's
but isn't that any principle?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be completely asinine, but I do mean that's true of any principle. That's why we adhere to principles and not to
Well, okay. Is it true of every principle? So it's true that once a principle is stated, then everybody tries to shape it to their benefit. That's unremarkable. That's
to lasting or unlasting effect, right?
But it is, maybe it's more surprising in this particular context because the First Amendment is, something that so many of us, so many Americans take as sort of part of their identity, and it's the thing that we're all proud of, or has been for so many years. It's something that makes us proud about this country and is a symbol of our democracy, and yet it too has been misshapen distorted by.
I have a different explanation I want to bounce off you. The situations that you describe in which it is made to do work you wouldn't necessarily expect it to do are situations in which lawyers can control the facts with exquisite precision. So if you think about Citizens United, this is a situation in which David Bossie and his crew, under advice of counsel, design a political intervention in order to challenge a very specific set of laws associated, parts of BICRA. And this was lawyer controlled. The facts are massaged and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but it's a reflection of the power that you're describing, that you get a lot of control over the facts. A protest is a chaotic situation. Nobody has full control over the facts. And so cases come up in this situation in which somebody says he beat me or he hit me with a nightstick, and the officer says either no, I didn't, or I felt threatened, or right. So you have this contentiousness about precisely what happened in a way that tends to militate against statements of high principle, because the facts aren't well enough massaged often enough to lend themselves to that. So what tends to happen is somebody gets charges filed against them, and then the charges get dropped. And then if they bring the suit, they lose because there's qualified immunity.
I think that maybe goes partway to explaining it. I mean, I do think that there are cases brought by human rights groups, which human rights groups or civil liberties groups are trying to move the First Amendment in a particular direction, and they are very careful about the plaintiffs they represent and the facts that are implicated in the suit. If you think about Humanitarian Law Project, that case.
I was just going to say.
So that was a very carefully designed suit. David Cole and Shane Cudidal at CCR, put it together. Very careful about the organizations they chose to represent, the specific activities that those organizations were going to engage in. Designed the case so that the activities were, on all fours with activities that the court had previously protected, in 30 and 40-year-old cases.
No, but it led to very clear law, albeit law you don't like.
Yes.
Right. It's just
my complaint is not. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, but part of what you're describing here is that there isn't a lot of clear First Amendment principles, and right. HLP is an example of, David presented that in a very clean way, and John Roberts said, yes, this is speech, it's core political speech, and Congress has banned it, and that's totally fine.
So I think that there are actually two different problems. You're right that so there is very little law on sort of, especially recently, on kind of core political rights within the scope of the First Amendment. There's just very little law. And the law that exists is not good law. It's law that says these rights aren't protected. And HLP might be my the first case on that on that list. Whereas if you look to these areas of the First Amendment that again, I'm trying to leave aside the question of whether these cases are rightly decided or not, but look to areas of the First Amendment that don't flow as naturally from the right to speak or the right to petition the government, where there are a few logical leaps you have to make to get to the right. There, the court has been very active. The court has been very active in extending the First Amendment to these contexts where, most of us, don't intuitively think that the First Amendment should protect data brokers, that are just engaged in the business of being data brokers. Whatever you think of the rightness of that decision, it's just not, it's a little further afield from the rights that most of us think the First Amendment was principally intended to protect. And there, the court has been very, very active.
Daniel, you get the last question, I think.
I'll insert two brief questions. One, with respect to the manuscript clearance system, how much of the problems have to do with retrospective classification? And the second is with respect to social media platforms and free speech. If one did a little comparison between Reddit and Twitter, which has done a better job, say, controlling online harassment and kind of balancing, controlling the harassment with free speech protections.
That one I'll let Kate answer. But the first one, I think that I think retroactive classification is a small part. I mean, it's definitely a problem that when it comes time for people to when people want to publish manuscripts of their government experience, suddenly stuff that wasn't classified previously becomes classified. Precisely so that they can't publish the manuscripts they want to publish. I think that's actually a small part of the problem, though. Even if retroactive classification were altogether forbidden, the pre-publication review process would still be entirely broken, and that's a complaint that comes not just from civil liberties and First Amendment lawyers, but from people from across the ideological spectrum who've had experience with this system, both as authors and as reviewers or censors. Nobody defends the current system. Some people do think that some version of pre-publication review is necessary and unavoidable. I'm not so sure about that, but some people do think that. But nobody defends I haven't heard anybody defend the current system. And I've spoken to former agency general counsels and former intelligence leaders from many of the agencies, and nobody's a fan of the current system. Kate, you should answer the last question.
What? I forget what the last question was.
Twitter or Reddit, which is doing a better job?
Oh, interesting. I tend to agree that Reddit is doing a better job, but I want to remind everyone how much we hated Twitter. Just 4 years ago, 5 years ago, they had completely abandoned. I remember, for me anyways, a bunch of my friends were leaving Twitter in droves as people who'd worked there because it was seen as really a sinking ship. Of they didn't have the numbers to match they didn't have the new numbers increases, and this is kind of part of the argument for Donald Trump saved Twitter, which is kind of they didn't have any of that kind of stuff. But they've also gotten much better at kind of dialing in user level specific user level specific dial-ins for harassment. The scary thing about that, as many people have told me, and now I have recently learned, is that you can block someone or mute someone and they can continue to harass you and threaten you and do all of these crazy things and you never see it. And so if they're if it escalates to a level of actually threatening you, it's actually quite scary. Which is kind of unfortunately something that I've recently kind of been the other end of. But we have a bunch of polls going, and Ben just put them up. I think that do you think Reddit or Twitter is better? What do you think? They're just such different. This is always my point, which is these are such different products. You just cannot conflate between them. They speak to different audience. How people speak is different. It's the equivalent of basically being how people speak in a town hall versus how people would speak in an op-ed to the New York Times versus how they'd speak to their friends. I just think it's all so different, and I don't think that you can make it similar. But we try constantly to find analogies, and
even on a single platform, right? It's still complicated. What counts as better on Twitter is obviously a highly contested question. Yeah.
I think it's a great question. Why is it better? What is it doing? Why is it better?
Better at what? Yeah.
Better at what? I see less. I mean, I don't know, Twitter, or Reddit is still an incredible repository of information and conversations, and it is a very old school internet way of continuing to structure those. The sub threads and threads is I don't know, we still kind of think of things in those ways, but it's been I think that is a really unique to the early internet of kind of lambda moo and things like that you would have kind of threads and sub threads to things.
So today's poll is up. It has two questions, and it tests your views of congressional and executive power. The first question asks whether Congress should act to prevent Kate's parents from evicting her.
That was an actual vote that people put up that should be asked. That's terrifying.
The second question, which is the more evocative one, I think, is if Congress fails to act, should President Trump issue an executive order to prevent Kate's parents from evicting her?
No. No. The answer is no.
So,
I just naturally that he has Article 2 authority to do that thing.
Exactly. Well, so
it looks like law schools want to get rid of property law, and this is a very good example of why you should not get rid of property law.
Well, I would just like to point out that there is strong pro-Kate congressionalist sentiment here.
We have like a strong democracy contingent.
I think there's a strong contingent of 34 votes to 9 who believe that Congress should intervene in Kate's housing dispute with her parents. On the other hand,
to be clear,
if Congress fails to act, the viewers of In Lieu of Fun are just happy to throw you to the wolves, Kate, because only 10 people think President Trump should get involved to protect Kate from eviction. 31 voters
at that point, I'm just moving in with Jameel, so it's fine.
All right, so Jameel, it has been a pleasure.
Come on, anytime. We had no shortage of things to talk about, and I feel like
we didn't even get to some of them, right? So
no, we didn't even get to TikTok. I was like,
oh wait, let's do TikTok very quickly.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that no one is talking about the First Amendment in TikTok? That was like all I said to every reporter that called me, and then none of it got reported. What do you think?
I think people just thought, it's a Chinese company. What does the First Amendment have to do with it? I think that was the.
But it's not just but it's operating.
I know. And
why does that have? Does that have?
So
an effect?
Where do you think the First Amendment right is? Is it the First Amendment right of the user to download TikTok and use it for self-expression, or is it the First Amendment right at issue of the company to produce a product that will then be used by people?
No,
right.
I think that would be a complicated argument, even if TikTok were Google in the United States. This question of how far the company's First Amendment rights go, I think deserves more scrutiny than it has got so far. But the users certainly have First Amendment rights. People who download the videos, people who post the videos, watch the videos, people who use the platform. In the same way that the readers of The Guardian have First Amendment rights, even
who's going to have standing though in a suit to
anybody who does not going to have access to Twitter.
Yeah, TikTok.
To TikTok.
I don't think there's a standing issue because. Kleindienst.
The injury is obvious.
The cases involving foreign citizens who are denied visas to come to the U.S. and that Americans challenge the denial of the visa. Courts have found over and over that Americans have standing to challenge the denial of the visa. The problem comes in at the merits, how far does the First Amendment get you? I think is a hard question.
Okay, but hang on a second. Can I just push you on this? I have not given this question any thought at all, so I'm being an exploratory. I'm not necessarily challenging this because I disagree with you, just because I'm trying to think it through. IEPA is the same law that is used to impose sanctions on foreign governments.
Yeah.
So if instead of TikTok we called this the government of Cuba, and the government of Cuba produced an app that would sell to you, not give to you, but sell to you.
Yeah.
Is the analysis the same? You have a right, a First Amendment right to violate sanctions against Iran or Cuba in the interest of self-expression?
Yeah. That wasn't my argument even with respect to TikTok. All I'm saying is that you have standing to complain. Okay, so that's number one. And then number two.
Yeah, no doubt you have standing.
I think that the First Amendment is implicated by the government's decision to, ban TikTok in the particular way that it has. And since the First Amendment is implicated, the government should have to justify its actions in a way that, it usually has to when individual rights are implicated or when the First Amendment is implicated. So it would be some form of heightened scrutiny. Now, that doesn't mean the government couldn't survive it. I think that even here with TikTok, if the Trump administration can point to, bona fide security and privacy concerns that are distinct to TikTok and aren't just, an effort to penalize one company, on the basis of some other, illegitimate ground, then I think that it could, survive a First Amendment challenge. And I think that the same would be true in the hypothetical you just.
That has to be right.
Yeah.
That has to be right.
But there must be some. The First Amendment has to be part of the picture here, because this is a platform. It's a media platform that Americans use to share information, to get information, and the mere fact that the platform is hosted abroad, I don't think decides the question. The Guardian is hosted abroad, so is the BBC.
This is not a meaningful distinction anymore.
Yeah,
like when you have servers that are based all over the world.
I actually think that the argument is stronger in this context because Americans are not just recipients of the information; they're also publishers in this context. Yes. It's a social media platform. It's the Guardian; they're just recipients. So, yeah, that doesn't mean they're going to, a First Amendment challenge would prevail here. But I think that.
But there has to be a First Amendment analysis.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's got to be right. It's got to be right. All right, we are 8 minutes over, for which I do not apologize because this has been interesting. Jameel, come back anytime.
All right.
With as much or as little facial hair as you desire. Kate, who's our guest? Who's our guest tomorrow?
Jill Filipovic.
Jill,
talk about her book, OK Boomer.
And do I get to lead the conversation with the observation that just the other day, Kate, when asked what your political view was that everybody would disagree with, you said, I don't believe in generations. And so I can put you in the red corner, put Jill in the blue corner, and let you fight it out?
Oh, completely. That will be fun.
Excellent. That's what I'm going to do. All right.
Thanks.
And thank you. And until then, 22 hours and 51 minutes from now, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have novel First Amendment issues that we all wish we didn't have to think about.
It's so true. Bye.
Cheerio.